Okay, we are recording now. Hello, everyone. I'm back again with another Malazan discussion with my good friend, Dr. A.P. Canavan. Hello, A.P.
Hey, Philip. Or sorry, Dr. Chase.
Okay.
Or is it Dr. Fantasy?
Oh, yes. Well, I have been called that before, yes. So and I will let everyone decide, exactly what connotation to go with that title. So, but it's great to see you, AP. Thank you for that.
Do you want to start again? You
No,
can
it's
record your
okay.
intro again and just edit that chunk out.
No, we'll go with the Dr. Fantasy thing. That's I like it. So we are actually here to talk about Midnight Tides, and I have a kind of, oh yes, of course. Once again, you have the better cover, I must admit.
It's not necessarily the better cover, but this is the Bantam trade.
Okay, yeah, mine is a Tor. I think it's a fairly early edition I have this time, but well, I like your cover better. So, but all right, it's got the same words inside, and that's what counts. So, so we are doing our non-spoiler discussion today of Midnight Tides. This is book 5 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. So we are about halfway through our discussion series, and we will also be doing a spoiler-filled talk as usual, which will appear in a few days on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon, which is absolutely a fantastic channel for analysis, not only of the Malazan books, but AP, you're doing a few very interesting things over there on A Critical Dragon. So,
well, I hope they're interesting. I'm trying to increase the number of fantasy authors that I look at an excerpt of their writing, and I go through it, because even if you haven't read the book or you've heard about the book, by me going through their writing and sort of talking about their techniques, you get an idea of the style and whether or not that's the kind of thing that you want to read. And I thought that would be fun for people.
yeah.
So
it's brilliant. It's great stuff. And I have to say, probably my favorite thing that you're doing right now, and we'll get on to our discussion of Midnight Tides in a moment, but I think our listeners would very much like to hear about what you are doing with Steven Erikson. Every week, there's a series that you guys are doing. There have been 3 so far, I believe. And AP and Steven Erikson are together, basically taking apart, analyzing an excerpt, a short excerpt from whichever book. And they will be excerpts from books that you and I have read so far in our reread. So if you're following along with AP and with me, there won't be spoilers in those videos because you're only doing excerpts from books that we've read so far. Now, you two sit down for anywhere from an hour to 2 hours and analyze usually around a 1-page or so passage.
well, the first one we did was essentially the last chapter of House of Chains.
Yeah.
And we went through almost on a line-by-line analysis of how the chapter was put together, what all of the different links were between things, and the techniques that Erikson was using.
Right.
And we're taking suggestions from my viewers in the comments about what scene would you like us to look at, because Erikson has a belief that he has to, as an author, has to be able to stand behind any scene that he has written. And even though he hasn't looked at some of the work, for 20 years, it's been since the first early books were published.
Yeah.
Going back to it now, he's looking at it and going through it as, well, this is, as an author, this is what I was trying to do.
Right.
And then I'm sitting there as a reader and a critic, looking at it going, well, this is what I'm picking up from it.
Right.
And sometimes those things are very, very similar. And then other times they're different. And it's just a discussion between a professional reader, if you want, and a professional author about different ways to approach text and understand text. So it's been a lot of fun.
It's not only that, though. I would add too that you guys end up talking about things like show don't tell, and you talk about other aspects of writing, and you guys, both of you, throw out these amazing tips for aspiring writers. And it ends up being a really wonderful way to appreciate Erikson's writing. But also, if you're interested, look, I have paid money for one of those master classes that you see advertised all the time. And I'm not saying anything bad about the master class I took. It was actually very good. But that said, what you and Steven Erikson are doing is, in my opinion, even better, much better. There is so much to learn in these conversations. And the two of you are just, in the process of analyzing these excerpts, are throwing out all these fantastic tips for writers. So I would urge anyone who is interested in the Malazan books, but also interested in writing, or even just having these insights, just check out these videos. They're fantastic. So,
yeah, and well, hopefully, Erikson and I will be able to carry this on for the entirety of when I'm doing this Malazan reread with you.
Yeah.
And eventually, I mean, I would absolutely love other authors to be able to get them to come on, take an excerpt from their work that they're happy to discuss, to do the same thing, because this is not about saying this is good writing or this is bad writing.
Right.
It's an author saying, this is what I did, this is why I did it, this is how I did it. And me as a reader looking through it and going, well, this is what I see, and this is how I see it. And it's to show people, even if that's not the style that you want to emulate or the style that you want to read,
right?
It shows people what that style is, so you can learn even from, by contrast. I want to do something the opposite. You go, well, there's an example of it up there. And I think it'd just be a nice archive of videos to have in the future of all these authors talking about their work. And
it's free. So I can't believe it. I feel like I'm taking a master class when I'm watching these videos. So they're fantastic. But let's talk about Midnight Tides now. Okay. So lots to love in here. And this is our non-spoiler talk. We will get more specific about many of these things when we do the spoiler talk on AP's channel. But for now, I just thought that in a broad non-spoiler way, we're going to talk about the fact that this is book 5, and we are introduced to a new setting in book 5, a new continent. We are introduced to a new big plot in this series. So if you've read up till now, you know that there are basically 2 major plots that have been kind of dancing around each other a little bit. Well, guess what? There's a third plot that has entered the scene here in Midnight Tides. So, and you've given this wonderful analogy before about World War II and the different theaters of the war. And so here's our third theater. Pretty much, right? I mean, and it is at first you might say to yourself, okay, who are all these new characters and what is this new place? But there are some interesting connections as well, and we can talk about those in more detail. I don't want to give any spoilers here, but there are some threads that do connect this to the previous books. Yeah, and one of the things that I would say is not only is there a thematic connection, but people make a big deal out of it's a new setting and a new set of characters. And if you think of William Gibson's urban cyberpunk series with beginning with Neuromancer, that was a whole load of things in the sprawl that were all different novels exploring different things, all in this linked universe, in this linked world. Yeah. You had Ian M. Banks' culture novels. And again, it's a series of books, but you don't necessarily have continuity of character or continuity of a story arc. Right. But there were thematic connections. And yet those things never seem to be a problem for people. But when we get to, oh, it's a fantasy series, oh, well, hang on, it's changed setting and characters. You're like, okay. So I think setting reader expectation for this is important to being able to enjoy it. If you go in being disappointed that you're not with those other characters, or I just want to get back to those characters, then you almost read against the text, and you're not engaging with it to enjoy it the way that you could. So it's going in expecting, well, let's just see where this one takes us. Right. If Erikson had restructured this, that books 1 and 3 were a duology, books 2 and 4 were a duology, and this was a new starting book 1 of a different duology, Uh-huh.
People wouldn't have this problem because it's, oh, well, I read those two, and oh, I read those two, and now I'm going to read this one. But because we call it book 5, and because that's where it occurs in the sequence, people run into an expectation block, which is, it's just an odd, curious thing about fantasy series.
Well, and it's interesting too, because for me, some of my very favorite characters in the whole series are introduced in Midnight Tides. So I'm fine with him doing it this way. And I just, this is non-spoiler. You got to figure that eventually it's all going to come together as well. So, and so we'll trust Steven Erikson on that point.
And I would have to say, after 4 books, you get to this one and you go, oh, it's, you know what? So far, he's delivered. Yeah. And if you've read the first 4 books and gone, you know what? I am actually enjoying this. Then you go, right, give him the benefit of the doubt and let's see where this goes.
Yeah.
If you're a reader who's gone, I'm not really enjoying this, don't force yourself to read a book you're not enjoying. Life is too short.
Yes, indeed. But I so enjoyed this. There's a lot to say. Let's talk a little bit about the themes that appear in here, and we're going to detail these themes when we do, again, the spoiler video. But you have, obviously, there's themes that occur throughout the series. Everybody talks about empathy and compassion and all of that. That's all very much present. But some themes that are very prominent in this one. One is brotherhood. And it is something that he rings the bell early on, and you see it throughout. I don't know if you saw it. I think you probably did. Joanna did a really nice video where she talked about Midnight Tides, and she mentions this theme of brotherhood, as well as this theme of reciprocation. So she nailed it really with both of those themes. So reciprocation is another one in here. We're going to fill out the details when we talk spoilers, but
well, just very briefly on the point of reciprocation.
Yes.
Now, I am open to being corrected on this by people who actually have studied it. But one of the aspects that is examined in these novels, and it's not giving away a huge amount, is this concept of capitalism.
Yes.
It's a general theme. I'm not going to go into specifics, but pre-money in this world, you had a lot of transactional relationships. You had gift giving. You had the idea of, if you gave someone a gift, there was an implied reciprocity. Right. So when we look at the ancient world, when we look at Anatolia, when we look at Sumeria, the idea of our current monetary system as the way that things were valued, that's an alien concept to those societies.
Yes. And
so this concept of reciprocation actually has an economic aspect to it that's tied into our own ancient world.
Yeah, very interesting. And it is, of course, a very important glue for society, holding things together. So yeah, it's an important concept for many ancient civilizations. Absolutely. So we'll talk about that in more detail later, but there's also familial and personal patterns of behavior that can often be self-destructive. And this is a kind of repetition of trauma, and it can be intergenerational. It could be within one's own life. And as I was reading Midnight Tides, I was reminded of a couple things in regard to that. There's a wonderful short story I mentioned probably before called Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, where there's this character named Sonny who is a heroin addict, and he's also a musician. And these are both coping mechanisms of a sort for dealing with the trauma that he's lived and the suffering. Suffering is a very big word in that story. The setting is Harlem in the 1950s. And so it emerges in the course of the story that Sonny's father also, of course, suffered trauma, and he was an alcoholic. And you see this kind of repetition of behavior, of addiction, of self-destructive behavior. And there's a point in the story where Sonny is talking to his older brother. The older brother is the narrator, and he reveals, it's always been a question of the older brothers. Why did you, he doesn't understand his younger brother. He doesn't understand the music. He doesn't understand the drugs, all of this. And Sonny's trying to explain this to his older brother after he's gotten out of prison. And he explains it in a way that really kind of opened my eyes a little bit. And it's a beautiful story. But it was a way to make sense of the pain, to feel like that there was a reason for it, right? So I just thought that was a really amazing thing. And I'm also, as I was reading Midnight Tides, and I was reading about some of the self-destructive behavior, these repetitions of trauma, I was thinking of my own personal, on my mother's side of the family, I have a cousin who was murdered by her husband. And her mother, my aunt, was murdered by her husband. And my grandmother was abused, and her second husband attempted to murder her. And you see this repetition of trauma, you see this repetition of behavior. And it's a difficult thing to talk about, but it is a very real thing. Of course, you'd want to ask the question, what is wrong with these men who do these things? But there's also the question I've often wondered myself, why do the women get into relationships with men who treat them this way? And this is something that I thought of in a big way while I was reading Midnight Tides, very serious. And I think Erikson does a really good job with this particular aspect of the story. But it's a repetition of behavior. You can see it in my own family history there. There's a repetition of this behavior and a reenacting of this trauma. And so I just thought, wow, there was a point in here which I found extremely emotional and resonating with me. So we'll talk about that more when we do the spoilers, of course.
Yeah, and I think that ties into one or a couple of the different themes and aspects that we've already seen earlier on in the books. So the idea of history, not necessarily history repeating, but history having a direct impact on the contemporary.
Yeah.
That what happened in the past, be it the ancient past or the short distance past, has a resonance and impact today. It has shaped us today.
Yeah.
And we've seen different aspects of that examined over the course of these books.
Yeah.
We've also seen how aspects of behaviors that have been codified by society, these structures can perpetuate without anyone needing to perpetuate them, that once they become part of the tradition, this is how we do things, this is how things should be,
Yeah.
that suddenly we've set up a self-perpetuating mechanism, and
Yeah.
that's been explored. And we see more of that here as well. And I think obviously in Deadhouse Gates, the journey of Felison,
Yes.
where we see a lot of that aspect being explored, we see some of those things seen from a different angle, explored in a different way, that all of these ideas of personal trauma, societal trauma, these are complex and nuanced. There is not one single example. There's not one single way of looking at something. And I think one of the things that Erikson tries to communicate in this book and in almost all of his writing, is looking at these very complex issues by giving us different examples and showing the examples from different perspectives, sometimes from the internal perspective of a character, sometimes an external perspective, sometimes a main character, sometimes a side character. And we see a lot of that. And tied in again to this is something that we saw with the exploration of Karsa in House of Chains.
Yes.
We see again this attempt to articulate a deconstruction of the trope of the noble savage, the trope of tribal society.
Yeah.
And just like the representation of capitalism or civilization, it's never Erikson's, well, actually, let me rephrase. I don't think that it was Erikson's intent to offer, this is what this thing is. It's an invitation to the reader to view these things and evaluate them themselves, so that because we get all of these different angles, because we get these different examples, that we are building up different ways of looking at, analyzing, conceptualizing all of these different themes and concepts.
Right.
And that's what I really enjoy about this series in particular, is
Oh,
the
yes.
invitation to the reader to engage and not be told, this is what this is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. And he does the same thing, as you said, with this trope of civilization versus the noble savage. This is another theme, if you will, in Midnight Tides. And it's very interesting the way, we'll talk about it in the spoiler video, but it's very interesting how this plays out in Midnight Tides. It's a very prominent part of the story as well, as is capitalism and power and corruption and exploitation. But it is not just a, capitalism bad type of narrative here, is it? There's a lot more to it than that.
It's a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah.
Because, capitalism, a little bit more complex than that.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're looking for some nice nuance, this is the series for you. Yeah. But these are themes that definitely are a big part of Midnight Tides. In a way, the capitalism theme is something that we've talked about imperialism, which is a slightly different thing. But here, the capitalism comes to the fore a little bit more in terms of the themes. And it's very interesting what happens in the course of this, as far as how Erikson portrays the various cultures at play in here and their relationship to capitalism and the mindsets that come into play and the extreme forms of these mindsets that affect the story. So go ahead.
Would you go as far as to say it's in shades of gray?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Sorry.
Ties to Edor. And then there's other shades of gray, which we don't need to talk about. Yeah, so all 50 of them. So I mean, you brought it up, AP. Sorry.
Yeah, I deserve that.
Yes, you did. But there's also, speaking of comedy, thank you for bringing in a little comedy. We need our lighthearted moments here. Midnight Tides has them as well. And what's interesting to me is we've often remarked before about the range that Steven Erikson has, that amidst these, for the most part, very there's a great deal of tragedy in these stories, but there's also some lightheartedness, and there's of course the compassion and all of that. But the comedy that Erikson puts in here is very important. And in Midnight Tides, I felt like, and totally disagree with me if you want to, I felt like, especially in the earlier portions of the book, there was a clear back and forth between the more comedic narratives and the more tragic or serious narratives, as represented by certain characters, which we'll talk about when we do the spoilers. It's almost, I know people have used this word a lot when talking about Steven Erikson's writing, and it's not a word I would usually use. It's the word Shakespearean. And it's because I think when most people hear Shakespearean Shakespeare, they think of, it's the equivalent of having to eat broccoli, or it's good for you, right? But I don't really like it, but it's supposed to be good for me, so I guess I'll do it. I don't. First of all, I think that's a misconception. Shakespeare was highly entertaining in his own time. He wasn't some highfalutin, just philosophical, icon of literature who was standing. He was an entertainer, right? Shakespeare was. So, but I do think that Midnight Tides is Shakespearean in the sense that in a lot of Shakespeare plays, Hamlet, for example, there's some really deep stuff, but right next to it, there are some, phallus jokes, and there's this really crude, good humor in there. There are some good laughs, even in the most tragic Shakespeare plays. And I think this is something that Erikson does really well in Midnight Tides. What do you think?
Well, I would agree. And also, when you say Shakespearean, people think I think one of the common ways people interpret that is very formal language, this
Yes.
highfalutin iambic pentameter,
Right.
very old-fashioned Elizabethan style language.
Right.
But we forget that Shakespeare was, as you pointed out, he was a man of the people. He was putting on the local variety show that everyone went to see, no matter what part of society they were from. And yes, he had these complex, noble characters. He had elements of philosophy woven in, but he also included the rude mechanicals. He included characters that spoke to everyone. He included lowbrow humor, highbrow humor, wordplay. The variety of humor worked into Shakespeare, even in some of his most serious work, it's astounding. And part of the issue with humor, though, part of the issue with any type of comedy, it's not always going to land. Everyone has a different appreciation of what they find funny, why they find it funny. But I agree with you. I think some parts of this book are absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
Sometimes the humor is being used to disguise a very serious point.
Right.
Sometimes the humor is being used to give the reader some relief after a very serious or very poignant or very dark moment.
Yes.
Sometimes it's there solely to entertain.
Yeah.
You know, there are all of these different elements. And when you have variety of humor, and this is what we see throughout the Malazan Book of the Fallen, when you have variety in different storytelling, when you have all of these different characters and plot threads, some will land more heavily, some will resonate more heavily and more powerfully with an individual reader than others. And I think like some of the funniest stuff from the series is in this book.
Yeah.
But it's, for the most part, radically different from a lot of the Marine humor or the soldiers' humor that we've been discussing before. It's a different approach to the humor.
Yeah. In a way, the humor in here reminded me a little bit more of the Bocaline and Corbel Broach books. There's a horror element to the humor in Midnight Tides, at least some of it, but there's also this kind of body humor in here, and you have to be okay with appreciating just how ridiculous an animal we are sometimes. That's the type of humor that you have in here. Not so much the gallows humor that you have. Well, there's some of that too, as well, isn't there? Yeah, there really is. But we'll talk about it in more detail, I'm sure, when we get to those spoilers. But it was something that I certainly appreciated, because there are some really tragic elements to this book as well. And they do balance each other. They balance each other well.
And, you know, so far we've talked about some of the, in general, some of the big themes. We've talked about some of the tone. We've talked about all of these, and it makes it sound very serious. Then we talked about the humor, and you go, oh yeah, you know, there are laugh out loud funny moments. Reading this book, laughing out loud, and my spouse looking across at me going, what are you reading now? And I have read the passage out loud, and even out of context, elicited a chuckle. But I think one of the other things that I think is great to highlight in this is, again, there's a greater exploration of another aspect of magic for those people who crave knowledge about the lore and the world building and the magic system.
Yes,
there's some really interesting investigations and playing around with magic in a way that is very different to the preceding books.
Yes.
So this is one of those books that you go, I already know what the magic system is, and you read this one and go, huh, this is different to what I thought, and it makes sense, and this is really interesting, and I hadn't considered that.
Huh.
So it deepens our appreciation. And as you well know, having done a PhD, the more you research something, it's not that you know more, it's you find out how little you actually know and how much more there is to learn.
So true.
And that's what I love about these books. It replicates that experience of learning more, only to realize the more that you learn, the more there is to learn.
Absolutely.
And it's just this wonderful journey that you go on that is so similar to real life.
Oh yeah, very similar. There is even a point in here, which if we want to, we can talk about later, but there is a point in this story where I thought it was set up really well, where one character almost explains to another character how the magic works. And if you're one of those readers who's been all along kind of, I don't get this, read Midnight Tides. There's a point of, you're not going to feel like you know everything about it, but there's a sort of a really nice explanation in here, which is almost a sort of a, yeah, it's directed toward the character, but I'm reading it and thinking, oh, this is great stuff, because now I get it. Now I understand how this works. So yeah, we'll have to talk about that when we do the spoilers as well, I think. So excellent. Anything else for the good of the order, AP?
And again, like as we have come to expect from the Malazan books, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention there are some brutal, outstanding, epic fight scenes, epic scale conflicts, as well as some smaller scale stuff where it's much more personal. Again, this runs the gamut of, I believe Iskar Jarek always refers to, what is it, the fireball, lasers and fireballs?
Lasers and fireballs, yeah.
There's lasers and fireballs. There's sword play. There are big scale conflicts. There are little scale conflicts. That this is not holding back on giving us those exciting action-filled conflict elements. You know, it's delivering on all those notes as well. Yeah. So it was just, I know we get carried away with things like, oh, the language, oh, the prose, and we get carried away with theme. But I think some readers appreciate knowing that, yeah, there's action in here, there's magic in here, there's excitement, there's humor. There are some fantastic characters that you really wish you could meet in real life. Admittedly, you know, behind safety glass and, you know, with people protecting you, but you'd like to meet them.
Yeah. It's great. It's a ton of fun as well. It really is. And it's an experience that will move you, and it will make you laugh and bring you to tears, as it did me. So it's got everything. It's just great stuff. So one last question for you, AP. If I'm Dr. Fantasy, does that make you Professor Fireball?
Oh, Philip.
Or Professor Fireballs? I don't know.
That was naughty, Philip.
Oh dear.
You're going to get put on the naughty step.
Sorry about that. I couldn't resist. I probably won't edit it out either, but. All right, everyone. Well, on that note, thank you so much for watching. It's just such a, I have a grand time talking with you, AP, and I'm really excited to talk spoilers on this one. So thank you so much for being here today.
You know what? I was going to thank you to say it's so nice to be here until your last comment, Dr. Fantasy.
Okay. Well, everybody in the Malazan books has a nickname, so we need ours too, right?
Thank you so much, Philip. It really is a pleasure going through this stuff, talking about these books. One of the great experiences of literature is reading it. Yeah. But an almost equally enjoyable experience is talking to friends, exploring it, reliving those moments. And that's what this whole series of videos with you has been for me. So thank you.
Oh, likewise. And it's an honor and a pleasure every time. Thank you, my friend.